Right, this is Screencast 2 on Pride and Prejudice. We are looking in depth at chapters 5 through 8. So, do a little bit of summary first, and then we'll talk about some important kind of final thoughts as we kind of move forward. So, we learned that the Bennet's neighbors are Sir William Lucas, who's been recently knighted, which has elevated his social status, and his wife and their children. And the oldest daughter is Charlotte, who is Elizabeth's best friend. So, it's the morning after the Meryton Ball, and both families, the women of both families, the men don't associate or concern themselves with these trivial matters, but the women of both the families are sitting around. They're kind of breaking down the events of the ball. In the conversation first, they're talking about Jane and Bingley's mutual attraction and the fact that Bingley dances with Jane twice. And then they kind of move on to the subject of Mr. Darcy, and both families agree that despite the fact that he has a large fortune, which is even larger than Bingley's, and that he has good family connections, that he's too proud to be likable. Also, in these chapters, the Bingley sisters exchange visits with the Bennets. They are trying to befriend Elizabeth and Jane. Bingley is going to continue to pay attention to Jane, and Elizabeth is going to decide that her sister is well on her way to becoming very much in love with Mr. Bingley, but she's concealing it really well. To which Charlotte, her friend, comments that if Jane conceals it too well, if she's not very open to showing her feelings openly, that Bingley may lose interest in her, thinking that she's indifferent about his affections. And Elizabeth kind of remarks that it's better for a young woman to be patient until she's really sure of her feelings. We can see that Jane is not overly emotional, and she's just trying to make sure that of her feelings before she gets to kind of run away with her feelings. And Charlotte disagrees with that. So Darcy's going to find himself attracted to Elizabeth. He's going to start putting himself into situations where he is closer to her so that he can listen to her conversations at parties. At this particular party of the Lucases, Sir William attempts to persuade Darcy and Elizabeth to dance together, but Elizabeth refuses this time, likely because it's like tit for tat for the last time that Darcy refused to dance with her at the ball at Meryton. And then shortly afterward, Darcy tells Bingley's unmarried sister that Miss Elizabeth Bennet is now the object of his admiration. In chapters 7 and 8, the reader is going to learn a little bit more about the entailment, which means that the property has to pass to a man after Mr. Bennet's death and cannot be inherited by any one of his daughters. Kitty and Lydia go to visit their aunt, Mrs. Phillips, in Meryton and learn that the militia are going to be stationed there for the season. A note is going to arrive that invites Jane to Netherfield Park for the day. Both Mrs. Bennet and Elizabeth conspire to send Jane by horseback, thinking that it's supposed to rain, and if she gets there, she'll have to spend the night because she won't be able to ride back in the rain. But their plan works a little too well, and she arrives at Netherfield soaked to the bone and chilled. She takes ill, and she has to be put to bed. Elizabeth hikes over to check on her, and her arrival throws the whole household into a stir because she has soaked clothes. They're dirty. The bottom of her dresses, her hem is dirty. Her stockings are muddy. And they're like, the Bingley sisters especially are just like taken aback that a woman would allow herself to become in this state. That night, Jane insists that Elizabeth spend the night to take care of her. That night, the Bingley sisters, the Bingley family is together, as well as Mr. Darcy. And the Bingley sisters are making fun of the Bennet sisters, mostly because of their lack of fortune and their lack of social status, which kind of makes them bad marriage prospects. Bingley and Darcy refuse to join in. They defend the girls. Elizabeth joins the party, and the group have a discussion on what constitutes an accomplished woman. Darcy kind of outlines his standards, which are really lofty and high, about fortune and social connections and a lively mind, and Elizabeth, and they exchange very witty banter back and forth about that the perfect woman doesn't exist. Elizabeth says the perfect woman doesn't exist, and no woman could really live up to those standards. So a couple of final thoughts on this section, just really quickly. It's really kind of important that we see the introduction of the Lucases and the Bingley sisters, because it kind of sets into play the opening of a conversation about social rankings and the importance of such. You know, awareness of class distinction is kind of like a pressing reality in this story. It's going to color the attitudes of every character in the story, and on both sides of the coin, right? Both the well-born and the socially inferior they're gonna be likely to develop prejudices that blind them to each other, because that's just the way that it was. That's the way that it was set up. Charlotte, being is not the only one who notices that Jane does not display her affection openly. Darcy too notices and assumes that Bingley's feelings are far deeper than Jane's, which is going to foreshadow a major plot point that is coming up. I think that Austen really brings up the matter of the entailment to create a sense of urgency about the search for a husband, which is kind of that underlying. We've talked about this multiple times, and I've screencasted on it before. It's kind of the underlying plot point for the whole book, right? So this entailment, which means that the father's estate is not going to pass to a female. The Bennet sisters could be in real financial danger if they do not make solid matches. And so bringing this up here in this chapter stresses not only the value that society places on making a good marriage, but also that a good marriage is a prerequisite for a good life, and good here being a wealthy, established life. And so we see the plight of women kind of really articulated here through both the law and the gender roles that we have going on. Austen society leaves women very few options for the advancement or betterment of their situations, and that's important to kind of discuss there as well. The witty banter between Darcy and Elizabeth that we see in their interactions is revealing a lot about their characters and the true nature of their relationship. I talked about, we don't get a lot of physical description. What we get is really through the development of their characters, is through their words and their actions. And so through this banter and argument that they're constantly having with each other, Elizabeth is really providing Darcy with a kind of a glimpse into the deeper aspects of her character, and that really appeals to him, and it helps him attempt to start moving past that prejudice that he initially had of her, was that she was silly, that she was unwanted, when he refused to dance with her at the Meryton ball. And so the disagreement that they have over the perfect woman, while it reinforces the fact that he does have a really large ego, that he's really self-absorbed, that he's a little arrogant, it does give Elizabeth a chance to shine and show off her intelligence. And she doesn't live up to his societal expectations. Like, she's not wealthy and she doesn't have a lot of social connections, but he is attracted to her lively mind, which is demonstrated there in that argument that they have. And then finally, the last point that I want to make before I close out today is that this section starts to kind of undermine the reader's negative impression of Darcy, and we see that in the contrast between him and Miss Bingley. We still know him to be arrogant, we still know him to be proud, but we do see here that he is unwilling to join in Miss Bingley's dismissal of Elizabeth and her family, and it's her criticism of their middle class status, their lack of social connections, that really kind of set her up as a symbol for the societal standards that are confronting, that are oppressing really our Bennet girls in this novel, as well as we see that she has designs on Darcy herself, and so her actions are have a lot more to do with jealousy of the fact that his attentions are now on Miss Elizabeth Bennet instead of himself.